Hello everybody, Politiekman here. Because the Burger Creek is AFK for a while, he asked me to fill in for him. Today I'd like to talk about constructing a narrative. I will use the depiction of dead children in media as a means to demonstrate how two different narratives can be constructed, and I will then offer my thoughts as to what is really going on to demonstrate that both narratives are far from the truth. Many people have noticed that pictures of dead children are used in the media only when these children are brown. Images of migrant children and children in the Middle East who have died from a variety of causes are quite often used in the media. However, if a European child dies in a terrorist attack in Europe, they are generally either not depicted at all, or they are made unrecognizable. Although this observation isn't always true, some media outlets do choose to publish images of dead children who are white, I think the observation is true in many cases. From this observation, we can create several narratives. The first narrative is that of racism. We can assert that media outlets only show images of dead brown children because browns and blacks are considered less worthy of privacy than whites. This would then be because browns and blacks are not considered fully human by presumably white journalists and editors. This narrative can be supported by the example of the Share coach crash in Switzerland 2012. In this crash, 28 people died, including 22 children. This was a Belgian bus, so Belgian media reported extensively on the crash, with some media outlets deciding to depict images of the dead children. This led to outrage and several opinion pieces and editorials in other media outlets condemning the decision. The depiction of dead children from the Middle East is not met by this outrage and therefore must be considered acceptable. This would be a form of racism according to this narrative. The second narrative we can spin based on the same observation is the one pushed by the likes of Paul Joseph Watson. The media only shows images of dead children who are brown because the media is trying to create a narrative where brown children are the victims and worthy of pity, whereas white children are not. This narrative can be supported by the terrorist attacks in Nice and Stockholm. In both attacks, white children died but were not depicted by the media. On the other hand, images of the children killed in Syrian gas attacks were widespread throughout the media. This must, therefore, mean that the media is consciously depicting brown children in a different setting than white children. Both of these narratives are equally supported by circumstantial evidence, and neither narrative can be conclusively disproven. However, there is a third explanation which I believe to be far closer to the truth. When dealing with sensitive topics like violence against and the death of children, journalists and editors have a choice to make: to publish or not to publish. To aid in this decision, there are ethical codes for journalism. Some examples are the Declaration of Principles on the Conduct of Journalists, also known as the Bordeaux Code by the International Federation of Journalists, as well as the codes of ethics published by bodies like the Society of Professional Journalists and the National Press Photographers Association. All of these codes of ethics attempt to give some guidance as to where to draw the line between newsworthy enough to publish or private or sensitive enough to not publish. Each of these codes of ethics puts the journalist's loyalty with the audience first and foremost. To quote the International Federation of Journalists, "The respect for truth and for the right of the public to truth is the first duty of the journalist. In pursuance of this duty, the journalist shall at all times defend the principles of freedom in the honest collection and publication of news and of the right of fair comment and criticism." This indicates the default choice for the journalist is to publish as much truth as possible. Images of things that happened are part of this reporting, and as such the journalist should probably publish any images, including those featuring dead children. However, the ethical codes also tend to say something along the lines of do no harm. The Society of Professional Journalists says, "Balance the public's need for information against potential harm or discomfort. Pursuit of the news is not a license for arrogance or undue intrusiveness." And show compassion for those who may be affected by news coverage. Use heightened sensitivity when dealing with juveniles, victims of sex crimes, and sources or subjects who are inexperienced or unable to give consent. This indicates journalists should be careful when publishing sensitive or shocking material, including images. However, this still doesn't provide a clear line. Where to draw the line is subject of debate among journalists and media watchers. In 2006, the Center for Journalism Ethics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison published an article called "The Ethics of Children, Death and Photography." In preparation for this article, the authors contacted several editors and a psychologist to see what they had to say. The context of this article was a girl who had been kidnapped and whose dead body had been found 3 weeks later. Her image was plastered all over the media. The consensus among most of the people interviewed for this article was that there were two main objections to using these images. One was the issue that this focused attention on the girl, rather than the larger context of the story. She was in foster care and her murder was connected to a long history of severe failings of the foster care system. Although that objection was relevant to that specific case, it's not generally applicable to all media, so further addressing that would be beyond the scope of this video. The other objection, however, is widely applicable. This objection was her family. According to the psychologist, using the images of the girl put stress on the family. keeping the wound open and preventing the family from starting the grieving process as long as news coverage continued. This is a concern that's raised in other writings as well, such as the Code for Journalists, published by the Dutch Association of Journalists. This reads, "The journalist respects privacy of victims, survivors and patients, but also of suspects and criminals by avoiding general recognizability of those involved in any news story where the individual would suffer disproportionately should their identity become public, and where avoiding recognizability is not against adequate reporting. The omission of recognizable images is therefore in line with this guideline if the person in the image or their surviving relatives would suffer from publication of the image. Considering the publication of these images can potentially hurt the grieving process, a case can be made that publication would cause harm to surviving relatives. Adding to that, publishing images of dead children is not necessary to report on the event that killed them. A journalist would have to mention the dead children, but showing them is not strictly necessary to achieve an adequate report. Hence, if something happens in the West, Western media will often decide against publishing images of the victims. However, if something happens in the Middle East, the likelihood of the victims' families being confronted with Western news coverage is smaller. These days, admittedly less so than it was before the internet, but in most scenarios it is still unlikely that surviving family members would be confronted with the images in a Western news outlet. I believe it is for this reason that Western media outlets are more prone to displaying images of dead Middle Eastern children than they are to displaying images of dead Western children. This explanation does not require an assumption of widespread racism, and it does not require assumption of some conspiracy theory in mass media. Instead, it follows logically from looking at a wide selection of ethical standards for journalists, as well as other writings on the topic. This goes to show that it is possible to build three entirely different narratives based on the same observation. Although I believe my third explanation is more supported by evidence than the other two, it is still based on circumstantial evidence and some degree of speculation. This means none of the three narratives can be proven or disproven conclusively. Of course, this same principle goes for virtually every observation or fact. There is often a lot of room for interpretation, and by selecting the correct evidence, a convincing case can be made for many different narratives that may or may not be true. This is why it remains important to do your own legwork and try to find the truth for yourself rather than depending on someone like me to tell you what to think. To help you get started, I will ask the Burger Creek to include my citations in the description below. If you do want to hear more of what I think, go and check out my channel. It is not a skeptic or anti-SJW channel, but we discuss everything from Islam to social science to international politics, with some detours through the realm of social justice and the occasional bit of history. A massive thank you to the Burger Creek for offering me this slot. My name is Politiekman and I hope to see you all again soon.